Okay, we will get started. Thanks for coming midday, windy day. Hope you all had a great spring break. Just a few opening comments here before we get started. Again, I just want to thank you all for attending this year's Presidential Lecture Series, sponsored by the Northwestern Institute for Citizenship Studies, which is in the Social Sciences Department here. And I want to thank particularly my colleague, Dr. Aaron Mason, Political Science, for helping organize this event. Not least of all, our guest speaker, Dr. Michael David Cohen. And it's wonderful to be back after a 2-year hiatus because of the COVID pandemic. So it's kind of like relearning how to do this process again after a couple of years. So it's great to be back. And I think, Dr. Cohen, you said yesterday, we're kind of making up for lost time. We're going to be talking about 2 presidents today, not 1. So we're going to kind of make up for that. Just a friendly reminder for audience members to turn off all cell mobile phones during the discussion. We're going to go about an hour or so with a discussion format with Dr. Mason and Dr. Cohen. And then we'll open up at the end opportunities for any comments or questions from the audience. And we do have some microphones. We can, if you want to come up, we can have that discussion for a few minutes afterwards. So we'll do that at the end. Many of you have done the sign-in sheet. If you're in my or Dr. Mason's classes, please be sure to fill out that sign-in sheet in the back before you leave today, if not already. Also, we do have some Institute brochures, and then Dr. Cohen has a few business cards up front of the table here if you want to pick one up at the end of the session. Well, today we're going to be discussing the life and legacy of 2 of America's lesser-known presidents from the middle of the 19th century, Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. I think what many will find quite fascinating, quite interesting, is that much of what was happening during this highly transformative period included these 2 gentlemen. There's a lot happening in American history, in European history, and world history. It's so it's interconnected. I'm increasingly fascinated the more we talk with Dr. Cohen about what was happening. So they're part of this really transformative period in American and world history. President Taylor died very early in his term, and Fillmore filled out the remainder of his term. So the presidential period was 1849 to 1853. But we'll be talking about a little bit of what was happening prior to 1849 as well as their legacy after that point. Again, our speaker is Dr. Michael David Cohen. He's a research professor in the Department of Government and a faculty fellow in the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He's a historian of the 19th century, and he serves as editor and project director of the Correspondence of Zachary, Taylor, and Millard Fillmore. And this project aims to locate and publish the letters of our 12th and 13th presidents. And I think it's going to be a 4-volume series, if I recall, a 3-volume series. This year's proposed as a 4-volume. So this will be a very detailed project. Dr. Cohen has had an extensive career as an editor. He was the final editor of the James K. Polk project at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He completed that project back in 2019. This was a decades-long endeavor. I think it was like 60 years, if I recall. So they finished that up in 2019. And that was publishing the 11th President's Letters. Earlier, he worked at Rutgers University in New Brunswick on the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. In addition to 3 volumes of the Correspondence of James K. Polk, Dr. Cohen has published articles on the history of U.S. politics, education, and society, as well as editing historical documents and journals, including the New England Quarterly and the Good Society. His book, Reconstructing the Campus, Higher Education in the American Civil War, won the Critics' Choice Book Award, the American Educational Studies Association, and the Linda Eisenman Prize from the History of Education Society. So he's a very distinguished fellow. He's also appeared on The Voice of America. He's delivered our previous 2016 presidential lecture on President Polk here at Northwestern, so we're glad to have him back. And in 2019, he organized a conference on James K. Polk and his times. I should mention, too, that near the end of our talk on these 2 presidents, that Dr. Cohen can share also with us briefly about career opportunities in public history for our students. And with that, I turn the reins over to Dr. Mason. Welcome back, Dr. Cohen. And if you just give me a moment, Dr. Mason, I'll get the camera turned back on you, and we'll go from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smalls. Appreciate that. Well, Dr. Cohen, I want to welcome you back to Northwestern. It was great to have you here in March of 2016 before COVID and everything. So, yeah, like Dr. Smalls said, we're still kind of relearning how to do everything we did before. First question, just want to ask you, in terms of, do you consider what you do public history? Is it academic history? How would you characterize what you do at American University?
Well, first of all, I thank you for having me again. It is great to be here again and to interact with people not through a Zoom window, as we've all been doing for the past couple of years. What I do is sometimes characterized as public history, sometimes as academic history. Most people who edit letters work in universities, sometimes in historical societies. I've always been working in the university. But the goal is to make original documents, primary sources in U.S. history, accessible to students, to scholars, to the general public. So we are providing a public historical service rather than analyzing the sources and writing books and articles about them, which is more the work of academic historians in most cases.
And your background for that, your educational background that prepares you to do that includes your degrees?
Yes, I have a PhD in American history. And after that, most people moving on from that will go into teaching positions. Instead, I went into this editing area. First, as Dr. Schmal said, as the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony at Rutgers, then as the Correspondence of James K. Polk, and now the Taylor Fillmore project. It's work that is done often by people with PhDs, often by people with masters in history. Some people come into it through other ways. It's, as I sometimes tell colleagues, it's a field that we usually get into accidentally. One of my favorite articles about our field points out at the beginning that no child ever says, I want to be a documentary editor when I grow up. We begin intending other things, then we find out that this field is here, which I find that I really enjoy and is something that a lot of people in schools and universities are able to make use of.
Yeah. I would like to mention, we do have the complete, it's all digitized now, the work you do with the Polk project, but if you are interested in the Institute room, we have the complete 14-volume set that Dr. Cohen worked on. So if you're interested in that, let us know. Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump into the substance of our topic tonight, or today, is the lives and presidencies of Taylor and Fillmore. Let's just start at the beginning, kind of a little compare and contrast real quickly. These two men, they kind of have different backgrounds in terms of their professional lives and how they ended up in the presidency.
Sure. They did end up serving together as president and vice president, and were ultimately members of the Whig Party and had very similar political views. But they came, as you said, from very different professional and social backgrounds. Taylor was really part of the rising Southern plantation elite. He was born to a fairly well-off family in Orange County, Virginia. And just as he was born in 1784, they were in the process of moving to a larger farm in Louisville, Kentucky. So he grew up around tobacco crops, corn crops, and around enslaved African Americans. His parents owned on that Louisville farm 16 men, women, and children who were forced to work the fields for them. And as he grew up, Taylor became more and more wealthy. He became a planter in his own right, acquired plantations, and enslaved African Americans in Kentucky, in Mississippi, and in Louisiana. Most of the time, though, he didn't live on those plantations. Early in life, when he was 23 years old, he joined the Army, just as tensions between the U.S. and Britain were escalating in what ultimately became the War of 1812. So he spent pretty much the next 40 years in the Army, largely assigned to frontier posts. He was commanding at various forts in what's now Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Oklahoma. He was the commander of the Department of the Southwest from Fort Gibson and Fort Belknap in eastern Oklahoma. But he also fought in a couple of wars, one known in the 1830s as the Second Seminole War, an effort to expel the Seminole people from Florida. And in the 1840s, he became especially famous as one of the lead commanders, one of the lead generals in the Mexican-American War. which I can talk a little more about that, but that was a large American success. As people at the time put it, the U.S. conquered half of Mexican territory. Everything from Texas to California used to be part of Mexico. So he was successful in the battles he led there and became famous and was brought up as a presidential candidate. Fillmore, meanwhile, he was also from a farming family, but on a much smaller scale. He was born in 1800 in Locke Township in upstate New York to fairly like lower middle class, you'd say, farmers, and spent much of his childhood helping on the farm, at apprenticeships in local textile shops. But he was determined to get an education for himself, so he positioned a dictionary on the wool carding machine that he worked on, so that as he was doing his work with the wool, every time he'd go past the machine, he'd look at it, see one word and its definition, memorize it, and then get another the next time so he could build up his vocabulary. He went to a few schools, eventually apprenticed to a lawyer, became a prominent lawyer in Buffalo, and that led to serving in the State House and serving in Congress, and then was ultimately nominated as Taylor's running mate in 1848 when they were elected president and vice president.
One primarily civilian his entire life, the other military man. Both have some roots in farming. Different parts of the country, the South and the West versus the North.
Yeah, and if you read the old presidential biographies, I think almost every 19th century president has a biography titled something like From Log Cabin to the White House. Taylor was in no sense born in a log cabin. He was born on a relative's plantation. But Fillmore was actually born literally in a log cabin. His family was that poor. He had sort of a rags to riches story.
Early influences in their lives, did they have, could you point to a particular hero that they both had that they emulated for their life?
For Taylor, I think the major influences early on were his father, Richard Taylor, and his older brother, William. Richard was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. It was actually as a bounty for his service in that war that he got the land in Kentucky on which Zachary grew up. William was also a soldier. He joined the Army about a year before Zachary did. That's probably both of their models was an inspiration for Zachary to join up. Sadly, though, William actually died in service, probably in a conflict with Native Americans near Memphis, less than a month after the younger brother Zachary joined the Army. In Fillmore's case, I think his greatest influence was probably Abigail Powers. She was one of his teachers early in life. He attended several schools for brief periods, and one of them was the school where she was teaching, and not only did they share a love of learning and books, but they fell in love, kept up a correspondence over the next few years, and then finally, once he had established himself as a lawyer, they got married. So she continued to be an advisor to him and later became First Lady. And she actually, along with Fillmore, because of their love of books, they together built the first White House library. Until then, each president had brought his own books in, then brought his own books home when he left. But they started the permanent White House library.
Did they have any particular religious sentiments that were expressed publicly that not guided how they lived?
If you read their letters, both of them do use the language of religion. Both of them clearly believed in a Christian God and an afterlife. But they don't seem to have been especially devout. It's unclear what denomination either Fillmore's or Taylor's parents were, what religion they had growing up. In Taylor's case, once he married, his wife, Margaret, was a devout Episcopalian. So he would often attend church with her, and her children were raised as Episcopalians. But Taylor himself never actually joined the church. Fillmore, when he married Abigail, she was the daughter of a Baptist minister. So definitely was raised in a religious household. But curiously, after they married, they both joined a Unitarian church. And it's unclear why they chose that denomination, but one of Fillmore's biographers speculated that it's more for social than theological reasons, that Unitarians were the church to be in for the upper middle class in Buffalo, so they saw social benefits to joining it.
All right, so we'll just kind of jump through. We talked a little bit about their professional lives. So we get to the election of 1848, and the kind of set the tone for us about that election and how this ticket will come to be and be successful.
Well, the election of 1848, at this time, Polk, whom I worked on previously, he was the president, but he was not running for re-election. And the real issues in this election stemmed out of the Mexican-American War. While Polk was president, Taylor, as one of the lead generals in the Army, had been fighting this war in Mexico that had evolved out of a controversy over Texas, over whether the U.S. or Mexico could control Texas and where the boundary of Texas was, a complicated series of issues. Ultimately, he and the other generals, as I said, were successful. The U.S. conquered this whole area, and the election of 1848, in large part, was a referendum on that war. The Democrat, a man named Lewis Katz from Michigan, was a friend of Polk's and a supporter, so he was the pro-war position. And Taylor, even though he had fought that war, he was running with the Whig Party, which were largely opponents of the war. And he actually refused to state his opinion on pretty much anything. People kept writing him, asking him, what do you think about the war? What do you think about slavery? What do you think about all these issues? And he'd say that I'm in the Army, it's not appropriate for me to express my opinions, and I don't even want to be president. He said this over and over, he didn't want to be president. But if, not knowing anything about what I think, and without my making any effort to become president, you choose to elect me anyway, then I will serve. And the election was complicated by a third party. Out of the Mexican-American War, issues over slavery came to the fore. The U.S. had acquired all this new land, and so the question was, will the land be free, or will white people be allowed to enslave African Americans there in the Southwest? Everything, as I said, between Texas and the West Coast. Both the Democrats and the Whigs kind of tried to avoid taking a strong stance on this so as not to alienate anyone. But a third party emerged called the Free Soil Party, with Martin Van Buren as its candidate, a former president of the Democrats. And their platform was that there will be no expansion of slavery, no slavery in the West. With these three candidates winning, it ended up being a complicated electoral map, but by a fairly narrow margin in terms of popular votes and a larger margin in terms of the Electoral College, Taylor won with Fillmore as his running mate. Back then, the candidate didn't get to choose his own running mate. The party chose him to kind of balance the ticket. Taylor was from the South, so we'll choose someone from the North. Taylor was, it was unclear what he believed, so we'll choose someone who we know has for many years been a solid Whig. So they became the two candidates and successful ones.
Did they, of course, Taylor's only president for a short time before his untimely death, but did they have any significant relationship as president, vice president? We know it was not common in the 19th century. Did they meet a lot, or did they, any evidence of that in what you found in the papers?
They did not, and it's actually funny. Our first volume of letters that we're preparing covers the period before the presidencies, the Mexican-American War period and some of the election. The very last letter in it is one from Fillmore to Taylor in which he introduces himself. He says, yeah, we were just nominated on the same ticket, but you've probably never heard of me. I know we've never met, so I just want you to know who I am and that I support you and I think we'll work well together. Then Taylor sent a very nice response. Yeah, I think you'll do great. You'll really help the ticket, and they kept on the correspondence after that.
Did they ever meet each other?
They didn't meet until they were in Washington to be inaugurated. They were staying. Once they were staying in a hotel in Washington, Fillmore came to say hello to the person who'd been elected president with him, and then the current president, Polk, invited them both to dinner. So they went there. So they'd only met a couple times before the inauguration. And once they became presidents, Fillmore, though he was vice president, he was largely excluded from the administration. At the time, the New York Whig Party was divided into a couple factions. The other faction was led by a senator named William Henry Seward. Seward very quickly got himself ingratiated to Taylor, so he kind of became the New York advisor, and he didn't like Fillmore. They were on different sides of the party, as I said, so he kind of excluded Fillmore So Fillmore really had very little role in the administration. The main thing that he was doing, which at the time was really the only official job for the vice president, was to preside over sessions of the Senate. And he did do that.
Okay. Yeah, because a lot of presidents in the 19th century, they would just go home and say, well, if you need me, call me. If there's a tie or whatever.
One of my favorite vice presidential quotes is from Theodore Roosevelt. He was vice president, then he served as president. While he was president, in the White House, there was a chandelier that it was jingling a lot, so he found it annoying. So he said, please move that, take it to the vice president's office. It'll keep him awake. Because until the 20th century, vice presidents had very little to do.
All right, so let's talk about the circumstances of Taylor's presidency. It lasts, what, about a year, approximately?
15 months.
15 months, okay. Anything notable during his time as chief executive? Foreign policy and domestic, if you want to break that down.
Okay, how do we start with foreign policy? The overriding issue of their presidencies was domestic, but there was really one big thing there that I think we should focus on afterwards. But other than that one big thing, the consequences of the war, most of the issues that came out were foreign policy, and I think because they tended to cross their two administrations, it's helpful to talk about that together. And they really span the globe. I think between the two of them, they helped to preserve the independence of the Kingdom of Hawaii, which was under threat of being taken over by European powers. They helped to negotiate a treaty. This was under Taylor primarily. A treaty with Britain about plans to build a canal across Nicaragua to connect the Atlantic and Pacific. They both fought against private Americans and others who tried to conquer Cuba on behalf of the United States. And I think one of the issues that really resonates today especially had to do with Hungary. In 1848, just as they're being elected, there was a wave of revolutions across Europe. And from France to Germany to Italy to Poland, people across Europe were trying to throw off the traditional monarchs and establish either more limited monarchies or, in a number of cases, republics. To have democratic republics in Europe along what largely was described as the American model. And Americans were watching this, reading about it in the newspapers, and they thought, this is wonderful. They're doing what we did in the 18th century, throwing off imperial and monarchical yokes, establishing republics. At the same time, Americans wanted to support them, wanted to get involved. The U.S. had this tradition of non-intervention in European affairs. Washington had talked about the dangers of what he called entangling alliances, getting too involved with foreign powers. They can be dangerous to us, and the U.S. had largely kept that with respect to European events, less so in Latin America. So this kind of tension between the two American ideas came to a head with the issue of Hungary. Until then, it had been ruled as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was run by the Habsburg family in Vienna. But in 1848, Hungary had its own revolution, threw off the empire, and established itself as an independent government, with its governor being a very charismatic man named Kossuth Lajos. He became popular both in Hungary and outside it as a great revolutionary leader. So when Taylor came into office, we had this newly independent Hungary, and he was deciding, should the U.S. officially recognize and take a stance that we're on Hungary's side, which carried the risk of kicking off Austria, which he didn't really want to do. So he decided he's only willing to recognize Hungary if it's clear that they're going to survive, that they're not just going to be reconquered by the empire. So he sent a diplomat over to Budapest with the authority to recognize them if that was the case. Almost as soon as that diplomat arrived, he found out that Russia was getting involved. The Austrian government had made an alliance with Russia so that together their armies would put down the Hungarians. It was immediately obvious that the Hungarians didn't have a chance against the combined Russian and Austrian forces, so the U.S. did not recognize them. A lot of Hungarians escaped the country, either elsewhere in Europe, they fled, or in some cases to the United States, and Kossuth himself escaped. And he tried to rebuild the revolution, to launch a new revolution for independence from outside his country. So in 1851, he made a trip to the United States, where he knew they were popular. He went around, participated in a lot of parades, a lot of dinners were held in his honor. He spoke with members of Congress, even the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, who were all very supportive of his cause. But he had to meet with the president in order to actually get U.S. support, whether than an official recognition or some kind of practical support for their fight against oppression. Fillmore agreed to the meeting reluctantly. He told Webster, who was planning the meeting, that I'll agree to this as long as the meeting's not just going to turn into Kossuth making a speech. Webster assured him that that's not going to happen, don't worry. So they were introduced at the White House. Kossuth immediately launched into a speech about their cause, how noble it was, how they're doing a similar thing to Americans, and this is every free man's cause. Fillmore waited patiently and then told him, I support your cause. What you're doing is wonderful. I wish you the best. But America has this tradition of non-interference in Europe, and we are not going to depart from that now. So Kossuth was left kind of dejected from the White House, participated in a few more parades. There was a big one in New Orleans, then went back to Europe. And Hungary did not become independent until the end of the 19th century. In the next year, in his message to Congress, what we would call the State of the Union, Fillmore went on at some length about how we do sympathize with these revolutions going on in Europe, but it is not the place of the United States to get involved. He cited Washington's farewell address about entangling alliances on doing that.
It's interesting with events going on today. America's role in the world and how it's changed over time, its perceived roles. So different foreign policy and domestic policy thing. One that we had talked about that I think is worth mentioning, which had implications for the 20th century, was the mission to Japan that Taylor actually ordered, Fillmore ordered, but then it was actually done finally under Pierce. But talk a little bit about that. Interesting.
Yes, and until this time, Japan was a very isolated country, including with regard to trade. They had a single port that was open to Dutch traders, but otherwise, when Americans and European powers sent ships over there to open up relations, open up trade, Japan had refused that. Once the U.S. has acquired all this land, including California, and also from Britain, the U.S. established control over Oregon Territory in the Northwest. The U.S. now has a West Coast. And looking across the Pacific, they see China. A lot of people, huge market for American goods, so they want to open China to trade. But it's a long way to China. They're traveling by sailing ships, and they're just starting to introduce steamships. But even with steamships, which are a lot faster, you need coaling stations along the way. So the U.S. wants to open trade not just with China, but relations with the Kingdom of Hawaii and Japan as the coal stations and stations for other provisions along the way to China. So Fillmore plans to send a delegation, a naval delegation, to Japan to open up these relations with perhaps an implied threat from the Navy ships being there. He doesn't get much support from Congress for this. I should say during their terms, they were members of the Whig Party, but Democrats had either majorities or pluralities in both houses of Congress throughout their terms, so they had some trouble there. But eventually enough private money and some available government funds were used to send this delegation over there. So they prepared a grand naval procession led by Commodore Matthew Perry. They brought a number of gifts for the Japanese emperor and shoguns. They included some guns, a telegraph, this new invention. They sent 100 gallons of Kentucky bourbon to present to the emperor. And in 1852, in 1852, they finally left the United States and headed off to Japan. By the time they got there, you're right, Franklin Pierce had become president, so Fillmore was no longer in charge, but the official letter from the U.S. that was delivered to the chief shogun, notes addressed to the emperor, was signed from Fillmore. And through negotiations under Pierce and under James Buchanan, his successor as president, they did open trade between the U.S. and Japan. Yeah. So that was successful from the U.S. perspective.
Yeah. But it was seen sort of as a threat from the Japanese perspective, that you need to open up your markets or else.
Yes, there were explicit instructions issued to Perry that you were not to threaten the Japanese, but accounts suggest that he did, at least in very clearly implied ways, threaten them. Once they arrived, they kind of presented that implied threat, left off these gifts, then said, we'll be back in 6 months, think about this, then headed off and the next year.
Fortunately, there was no bloodshed, though. Yeah,
That's correct.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an interesting way to open up relations between the U.S. and Japan. Was the United States the first? Well, of course, the Dutch had been there in the 16th century, but as far as what we would call more modern trade, was the United States really the first country to establish that type of relation with Japan?
Yes, on a large scale it was.
Yeah.
That was kind of what began the trend. After that, the British and the French did establish trade relations in later years. Yeah, you're right, the Dutch have been there before, but on a very small scale.
So it was a consequential thing that occurred during administrations that we oftentimes think is not having a great impact either on American history at that time or even now, but they were pretty consequential.
Yes, yes, they were.
Given the relationship between Japan and the United States in the 20th century, obviously, quite different, yeah. Okay, interesting. You said something interesting when we were talking about, when you study these types of people, I don't know, say it the wrong way, but you want to have sort of a detached view. You don't want to place any values on them. You just try to make the documents available. But as you look at their respective lives and the facts that you gather from the archival work that you do, what would you say are the strongest, the strong points of each of these guys in regards to their presidential styles? Do you think they had, what would be one really strong point of Fillmore, one really strong point of Taylor, and what would be their negative sides of their presidential styles?
Well, and as he said, I try not to judge these people, and the goal of a project like this is not to celebrate them or to denigrate them. It's kind of not the monument idea of history where you present just one great or bad image of the person, but make these sources available so people can draw their own conclusions. I think even going beyond their presidencies, there are certain qualities they had, certain things they did that most people would agree are admirable or completely detestable. Like both of them, as you can see from their letters, they really loved their families. They were very committed to their wives and their children. The love comes across in ways that we have, and we're fortunate we do have many of those. Fillmore was also a very intellectual person. As I said, he and his wife were book lovers and created the first White House library. And in his letters, he wrote to the publishers of Webster's Dictionary about what he thought they should include in the dictionary, how it can be most useful to the most people. He was saying, you may not want to include swear words, but you should include them because people may read them somewhere, hear them, and want to know what they mean. You can tell people don't use them, but put them in there and tell them that. In Taylor's case, maybe one of his best qualities was his willingness to serve. In the Mexican-American War, he didn't agree with the policy, but most of the time he followed his orders because he felt that was his duty. Though occasionally he did choose to consider an order to be more suggestion and adjusted it. And then when he was running for president, people a couple of years before the election started telling him, "You should be president. We want you to be president." He said over and over, "I don't want to be president." He said, "I want to stay in the Army, to retire, but what I want to do. But if you insist on electing me, then I will serve," and that is what happened. As far as their less admirable points, I mean, it's difficult to talk about anything besides their relations with and attitudes toward people of color. And Taylor, by the end of his life, he owned more than 130 human beings who worked at plantations in Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and he also raped at least 2 of the women he enslaved. He was the father to at least 3, probably 4 African-American children who he gave birth to, and they were slaves of his once they were born because of the rule that a child of a black woman of an enslaved black woman was a slave as well. And there are families today in the United States and Canada who trace their ancestry to Zachary, Taylor, and to Jane and Annie, these women. Fillmore, also Taylor spent much of his life fighting Native Americans, depriving them of their ancestral lands, and that was what his career was built on. Fillmore, he didn't fight in the army, and he didn't own slaves. They didn't pass slavery in New York by the time he was around. And he often said in his letters that he was opposed to slavery, that he thought it was terrible. On the other hand, he took action as president, and when we do get to domestic policy, we can go over that, to support slavery, to preserve slavery, because he saw that as essential for preserving the Union, avoiding having the U.S. split up. He even wrote in his letters when he said that he hated slavery. Someone sent him a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the famous anti-slavery novel, and he wrote back to the person who had sent it to him saying, "I haven't read it yet. My wife loves it, but thank you for sending it to me. I'm really torn up about this issue of slavery. I think it's horrible. I hope someday it will end and will expel all black people from this country and send them to Africa." Because he, like many people at his time, even Abraham Lincoln for a long time supported this idea, believed that black and white people can't live together in peace. So if you're not going to have black people as slaves, then you have to send them to another place. So that's definitely one of the less admirable historical parts of their presence.
Men of their time, yeah, they weren't able to rise above that. Yeah, right. Or some did. Some people did.
Yeah, some did. There was the possibility.
Yeah.
And we talk about judging people by their time. There were plenty of abolitionists in the 1840s and 50s. Virtually all black people, you could say, were abolitionists, but a number of white people too believed that slavery was morally wrong, and people should be treated as equal. They unfortunately were not among them.
Yeah, William Lloyd Garrison, the Transcendentalist movement, all those Emerson, right, Thoreau, they were generally opposed to those things. We're talking in the class the other day about the Transcendentalists and about protest movements in the United States and be willing to go to jail, not pay your taxes because you don't want to support the Mexican War. And so it's okay to dissent against the government when you think the government is wrong. So the basis of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, drawing some of its inspiration from the Transcendentalists and people like that. Other things interesting. Any famous speeches or orations that each of them made that we should know about, that we don't know about?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, they didn't give a lot of speeches. When they were running for president and vice president, they didn't really campaign themselves. It wasn't a tradition. So occasionally someone might come to visit one and they would give a speech. Fillmore would campaign for other people running for governor or other officers. But they didn't give a lot of great speeches. And when they were presidents, they didn't give a lot either. But there was one common theme. Taylor, when he gave his inaugural address, talked a lot about unity. And he really was determined at that point in his life to preserve the Union, to keep the Union together despite these opposing views over slavery. So he emphasized the need for us to be at peace, to work together despite differences of party or section. And Fillmore made similar statements. He didn't get to give an inaugural address because of the way he became president. He took over as vice president. But in 1850, a new railroad opened connecting New York City and the Erie Canal in Buffalo. So he and his cabinet went up there and they rode the line of this new railroad. And at every stop, he'd get out and give a speech. And his theme was always the same. It was unity. We need to all follow the laws, even if we don't agree with them. We need to remember the connections that we have with people in other areas, people with other opinions. Really preserve the Union, preserve a united feeling of Americans. And of course, he's referring to white Americans, primarily white male Americans.
Yeah, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a big issue, and Fillmore supported that, even though he said he opposed slavery. We talked about, yesterday, you and I were discussing that issue about what were sometimes loosely called the Liberty Laws that were passed in northern jurisdictions, northern states, at usually the city level, and there's also larger towns, but they would say things like, certain federal laws we won't enforce, like the Fugitive Slave Act. If the U.S. Marshals come in and try to find slaves on the run, we won't assist in their capture. And so you said you haven't found anything specifically yet on that from letters or petitions of people maybe complaining from the South that their slaves not being returned, or I just was curious about that.
That's right. I haven't found correspondence specifically about that, but that's mainly because at this point, my colleague Amy Larrabee-Coates, who's associate editor of the project, she and I are working primarily on the pre-presidential period, which will be the topic of the first volume. So I hope we do find things about that. I think it might be useful to give a little background about how that fugitive slave law came to be, bridging together with what I was saying earlier. During the Mexican-American War, as I said, the U.S. conquered all this land. Kind of was divided into three areas: Texas, which almost immediately became a state, and New Mexico, which was a huge area to the west of Texas, much larger than what we think of as the state of New Mexico, and California, which was everything west of New Mexico, much larger than what we call the state of California. So the question when Taylor and Fillmore came into office was, how are we going to admit these as official territories or states? Are we going to allow slavery there or not? And because basically southern politicians wanted slavery to be allowed there, northern politicians wanted slavery to be excluded, often for racist reasons. They wanted to exclude black people altogether in many cases. In California, they passed a resolution saying that we want to exclude black people, free or enslaved, from the state, or from state or territory. So it took a while before Congress could come to any agreement about this. Both Taylor and Fillmore contributed their ideas about whether these areas should be admitted as territories or states, slave or free, trying to build a compromise between them and Congress over this. It took so long that Taylor died before they were able to come up with any compromise. Then Fillmore, who was probably, his temperament was more in favor of compromise than Taylor's was, so he was able to work with Congress a little better to get that passed. And ultimately, the compromise that was reached, what was called the Compromise of 1850, was we'll admit California, which in this case is the modern state of California, that small area, as a state, and they knew that in effect that the state of California was immediately going to ban slavery. But we'll admit the rest of the area as two territories, a smaller New Mexico territory and Utah territory, which was inhabited mostly by Mormons and Native Americans. And for now, both of those would allow slavery, at least until they became states later on. But then a third part of the compromise, which included several other issues too, was the Fugitive Slave Act. There had been a fugitive slave provision in the Constitution that if someone escaped from slavery to another state, the person was still enslaved and could be returned to the person's owner. But this new act strengthened that and said that a federal marshal can go to catch the person and can enlist bystanders. Say, anyone who's standing around, you have to help me catch this person. And a lot of Northerners who weren't huge fans of slavery didn't like doing that and refused to do that, and sometimes instead worked against the federal marshals. So Fillmore, when he was making these speeches in New York and later in New England, saying we have to obey the laws even if we don't like them, he was talking about the Fugitive Slave Act, and you have to enforce it. You have to return these people to slavery, even if you don't believe in the institution, don't like the law yourself. He wasn't successful in preventing all opposition, but he did what he could to make that enforceable.
Yeah. That's just interesting. When we talk about this, it's an example of federalism where the Constitution says something, the Congress has the authority to mandate something, but the states may or may not actively enforce it, and they may even sometimes go contrary to it. We see that with a lot of other events today in different policy areas. Yeah.
And that was an even bigger issue before the Civil War. And the Civil War, the Constitution says the federal government is the supreme power of the land, but the Constitution the Civil War really solidified that interpretation of the Constitution that the federal government does overpower the states. The federal government has the final word. Before then, at several times, states in several regions of the country did try to overrule federal laws or pass laws that made it difficult to enforce them.
Political institutions and practices require some time and some inertia to kind of cause them to be solidified in what they say and what they can do, right? Okay, so we get to 1850, and then there's an event in Washington, D.C., and President Taylor is there, and what happens? His last name.
Yes, on July 4th of 1850, there was a ceremony at the Washington Monument, which at the time was still under construction, so it was half built. But there was a ceremony there for Independence Day. Taylor went there. He sat out in the sun for hours listening to a very long speech. He didn't have a hat on, so got the full brunt of the sun. It was a really hot day. Afterwards, he went back to the White House, and to cool off, he drank a lot of water and chilled milk and had a good deal of fruit, including, according to some reports, some cherries. Unfortunately, those were just the kind of things that carried disease. And Washington was more or less built in a swamp, and there was lots of disease around the area. And there had been some advisories lately from medical experts that you don't want to consume these foods because they may carry disease. Well, he got sick, got some gastrointestinal bug. He was given calomel mercury for it. They did some bleeding, the medical technology at the time. If anything, it made him worse than he was before. And after 5 days, he died on July 9th. So he'd only been president for 15 months. And at that point, Fillmore became president. It's curious that only two Whigs were ever elected president. William Henry Harrison became president in 1841, and Taylor in 1849, and both of them died early in their presidencies. And one of my students on learning that said it's the curse of the Whig Party. Fillmore became president, and immediately made one of his strangest mistakes. On his first day as president, he fired the entire cabinet. Then asked them, "Oh, but will you please stay for a month while I find people to replace you?" They declined, though a few of them did stay on for a week. So he had to scramble to find a cabinet he could work with.
Well, we covered both their presidencies. Then just to kind of wrap up, what are their legacies? How would you describe the legacy of Taylor and Fillmore individually?
I think their legacy has to be looked at in terms of the narrative leading up to the Civil War. On one hand, it's sort of misleading or historically anachronistic to say that they lived in the pre-Civil War period, because they didn't know there was going to be a Civil War in the 1860s. We only know that looking back in hindsight. On the other hand, they lived in the period that created the conditions that ultimately led to the Civil War. And the Mexican-American War that Taylor was central to had led to this escalated debate over slavery, not only over whether it will continue in the areas where it existed, but whether it will expand to new areas. I should mention Mexico had abolished slavery in most of its land, so if the U.S. were going to allow it there, they were going to be expanding into new areas. So their presidencies were dealing with this issue and coming to a compromise so that as both Taylor and Fillmore wanted, the Union would stay together. It wouldn't break up. There wouldn't be secession then. And they succeeded in that, but they didn't succeed in unifying the sentiment of the country. People on the more extreme sides of the slavery issue in the South and in the North were upset by the compromise of 1850 because it was a compromise. They didn't get the end of slavery. They didn't get the restriction of slavery to where it was entirely. They didn't get the expansion of slavery to the whole country or to the new areas of the country. So this division kept festering. And depending on how you look at it, either the compromise of 1850 that they both helped to bring about either caused the Civil War in the long term or postponed it for another decade. And that really was their major legacy to the country. Though, as you pointed out, there were other major things that happened during their administration. Opening up trade with Japan and through Japan with China was very important to future U.S. relations. Their efforts to avoid having a European power take over the Kingdom of Hawaii, ironically, ultimately led to the ability of the U.S. in the 1890s to itself take over Hawaii. So what was going on in their administration did have a long tail of consequences well beyond their presidencies.
Yeah. Not as inconsequential as we might think. Yeah.
No, certainly not.
All right, very good. Well, I think that's a good place to end the formal discussion here between us. Any questions from the audience? We're glad to entertain some. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
So-
would you please come down and use the microphone there? Thank you.
Sure.
Don't want to put anybody on the spot, but it helps the recording. So, Kylie Harsman has a question. That's great. Thank you, Kylie. Go ahead.
So you said that I think it was Zachary Taylor didn't express a lot of his opinions and stuff during the time of the election. So what led him to be favored over Fillmore for the presidency?
Yeah, well, for one thing, that's a very good question, because it's so different from today, when the presidents are constantly asked to give speech, presidential candidates constantly giving speeches, they have a platform at their convention. In Taylor's case, part of it was the tradition of the time that presidential candidates often avoided giving their positions and more generally didn't talk a lot. They would leave their campaigns to express their opinions. So that led to interesting situations where the campaign would say different things to different people. The Whig Party, when they were trying to promote Taylor, when in the North, they would say very clearly that he is opposed to the extension of slavery, and he will support any law that says we're not going to expand slavery into the West. In the South, they would say he is absolutely open to expanding slavery into the West, and he will not support any law. He will veto it if they want to exclude slavery from that area. And so Taylor, in a sense, had a motivation to keep quiet. If he doesn't say either way, then people can believe opposite things about him, and that can help him get elected. Both sides, both parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, did this kind of thing. And each of them criticized the other side for doing it. But he got elected partly on people believing different, sometimes inaccurate things about him, and partly on their support for the party in general, even if they didn't know much about the candidate, and largely just because he was such a popular individual. He won all these great battles on the Rio Grande. He conquered this new area for the United States. He had built a great relationship with the soldiers. He was kind of a very down-to-earth person who wouldn't wear a uniform. They called him old, rough, and ready. He was always ready to fight, but he looked rough. So he was just in a sense, a charismatic individual and an attractive one to them. So I think that more than any policies he would or wouldn't support helped him to get elected.
Next question. Yeah.
The point about their take on European policy is really interesting, and we're going through that debate in this country today. How do President Taylor and President Fillmore's decisions on foreign policy relating to Europe define that policy in America today? And what can modern American politicians maybe learn or glean from their choices and actions?
That's a very good question. And certainly, we do see the similarities in questions about relations with Europe, when and how to get involved with European conflicts, and the impact they have in the United States, the impact Americans can have on the freedom of Europeans. We see that today. They lived in, of course, a very different time in American foreign policy history. Back then, the U.S. was very isolationist in that sense with regard to Europe, and did not like to get involved within European affairs. The U.S. also had a very small military compared to European powers and compared certainly to the U.S. today. So they were operating in a different environment. Much later, after World War I, and really after World War II, or during and after World War II, the U.S. became much more a world power, one of the leading powers that wants to and is expected to have a role beyond its shores. Back then, the U.S. largely followed what was known as the Monroe Doctrine, because this is a statement drafted by John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, when James Monroe was president, that the U.S. had sort of a sphere of influence. The U.S. would be involved to some extent in American affairs, meaning North and South American and Central American. But Europe wasn't expected to, but we wouldn't expect or allow Europe to have much of an involvement here. The U.S. would be opposed if Europe tried to take over any Latin American country, for example. But left open the idea, and sometimes it was interpreted this way, that the Monroe Doctrine said the U.S. could get involved in those and could exert its influence in Latin America. But another implication of this was that the United States would not get involved outside its sphere. The U.S. isn't going to go to war in Europe or in Asia or in Africa, except for policing the illegal international slave trade off the coast of Africa. So their decisions, because they were operating in such a different climate, in such a different concept of American foreign policy, it's very hard for me to kind of adapt that to a modern situation when people have such different expectations of the U.S. and we have such a different relationship with these countries. So the one similarity is that belief in a moral connection, that they are people fighting against oppression in Europe or anywhere are fighting the same battle the United States fought in the 18th century, and that some anti-slavery people saw them as fighting in the 19th century, this fight for freedom, for individual rights. But in terms of actual government involvement, it's so different, it's hard for me to draw any connection.
Hi, my name is Austin Reagan. I'm a political science major, Dr. Mason's favorite student. And I was just going to mention first off that, we always celebrate July 4th, but in terms of presidents, it's almost kind of good to avoid July 4th since Zachary Taylor, his demise starts on July 4th. The old Jefferson died on July 4th, so did President Adams, and so kind of good to avoid that in a sense. But my question is, you mentioned briefly how Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore sort of ran on a balance ticket to where the Free Soil Party had been mentioned as a third party. And it kind of reminds me of when William Jennings Bryan was running in terms of being supported by the Populist Party later on in that history, and that's a little bit later in the 19th century. So I'm kind of wondering, this is sort of a question for you, Dr. Cohen, as well as Dr. Mason. Is this sort of a trend that you only see in the 19th century? Does it continue throughout the 20th century in terms of seeing those third parties also joining in and balancing tickets and affecting the presidential policy as well as just the presidential running platform at that time as well as in the present?
Very good question. Do you want me to start with the 19th century? Or?
Go ahead and I'll follow up.
Okay, well, the idea of third parties had begun not too long before this. The very first third party to run a presidential candidate, we were just talking about this, was the Anti-Masonic Party in 1832. And that's actually the party that with which Fillmore first entered politics. In 1828, he had run for the New York State Legislature and won as an anti-Mason, which was a party that was, its main platform was opposition to the Freemasons. What they saw as a secret society that was trying to dominate American culture and politics. And many politicians at the time were members of the Freemasons. So, there were once that kind of began, a lot of third parties did spring up. And for a while, they were usually about slavery. In different elections, the Free Soil Party or another one called the Liberty Party would spring up. They were to varying extents opposed to slavery. There were a couple, in one election, there were two different parties, both called the Liberty Party. It got confusing. And also, there were third parties having to do with nativist sentiment. In 1848, though they didn't run their own presidential candidate, there was a party called the Native American Party, also sometimes called the American Republican Party, in which their principle was opposition to immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants, very nativist and anti-Catholic organization. Then in 1856, Fillmore himself, this former president, actually ran with the third party. He was the candidate of the American Party, also called the Know Nothing Party, another of these nativist ones. And ironically, because they were associated with another secret society called the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. This guy who had begun as an anti-Mason now had to join the Order of the Star Spangled Banner in order to be their candidate. So they agreed to let him do it in a quiet ceremony in a house rather than publicly, because it kind of turning full circle. But yeah, these parties continued throughout the 19th century and, of course, into the 20th. They hadn't been there in the earliest days of American history, but from this period on, they were there.
Yeah, I think this relates somewhat to when you talk about institutions and practices have to take a while to establish themselves. The third parties kind of ran amok at this time, and later you have both federal and state legal reforms that deal with how parties operate. The Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974 changed some things that didn't exist in the 19th century. And you certainly still have third parties that try to play the spoiler effect. We talked about that in class, right? And you had Ross Perot in '92, where he received 19% of the popular vote. So that's by no means an unimportant event, but he received no electoral votes. So it was all for nothing because of the way the Electoral College works. But yeah, I would just say that there have been some reforms at the state and federal level that do change how third parties operate. But you're right, it was much more of a free-for-all. I forget the exact numbers, but the speakership in the House of Representatives was up from, that's like 1848 to, it's around this time period, excuse me, like late 1830s up to 1858, the speakership changed hands multiple times, even during the same session, right? You'd have this revolt against the speaker sometimes. And it was because you had all these different parties in the Congress, yeah. And plus, we've had this kind of dominance now of these two parties. We've always had a two-party system. We've really had a two-party system since the end of the Civil War, with these two parties that are in control, because we really had two different countries, even in the post-Civil War era, I would say. And that all began to change around, I'd say, 1980, 1990, when the Republicans and Democrats, everybody says they kind of changed their north and south axis and all this thing. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens as these two parties begin to age out of existence.
And you remind me of something I should bring up. In the election of 1848, as you were talking about Ross Perot being sort of a spoiler in impacting who won that election, essentially. In 1848, a similar thing happened. The Free Soil Party, whose candidate was Martin Van Buren, former president himself, and they were popular enough that, though they only won one state, Maryland, they got enough votes in other states that they very likely caused Taylor, as opposed to Lewis Cass, to win the election, to win New York and Massachusetts. They also did very well. So, of course, you can't know if they hadn't been there then how people would have voted, but it is entirely possible that they threw the election.
And then 1840, we talked about this in class, 1844, you had James Birney, a free soil anti-slavery guy, took enough votes away in New York to prevent Clay from winning, right? It was New York, Pennsylvania. New York. And that would have changed history forever. So we're always back to this problem too. Do we want to have lots of chaos and third parties and lots of voter choice? Or do we want to just have these kind of stable parties that theoretically keep us stable, right? So there's plus and minuses either way.
And each party there had its own factions within them. They were never...
they're not unified.
As they were saying, slavery really divided them in large part. In the North, we'd have Whigs saying, we're anti-slavery. In the South, you'd have Whigs saying, we're pro-slavery.
Right.
And within each state, I mentioned the divisions in New York between the Whig Party's factions. New York had an even larger split between the Democratic factions, the barn burners and the old hunters. There were all these
Yeah.
complicated divisions.
I think there was one called the Gold Bugs. Wasn't there in the 1890s? There were Democrats called Gold Bugs. Which I bring that up because that's the local high school mascot, the Alva Gold
I
Bugs.
see.
Yeah, but that's not why they're called the Gold Bugs. But yeah, there was certain kind of, it was dealing with the gold and silver standard, thing or something. But anyway, another.
As far as symbols, just random fact about the Whig Party. We identified the Democrats with a donkey and the Republicans with an elephant. The symbol of the Whig Party was the raccoon.
Yeah. Any other questions, guys? Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming today. Thank you for your attention. Good questions. And please, round of applause for Dr. Cohen.